Good. Have your Bibles to Exodus chapter 2. To clarify that, Exodus 2, looking today at the birth of Moses. There was one extra little announcement I should have made, and they're not here, but the Santucci's are grandparents again. Their daughter Elizabeth, known to some of us, had a second son, and I don't know if he's been given a name yet, but so they're certainly very happy. And I'm sure you'll be praying for them and sending your congratulations. But this afternoon, we're continuing our look at the book of Exodus, looking at the birth of Moses. Exodus 2, in fact, covers about almost 80 years, which is virtually the span of the book of Exodus itself. We're going to cover a lot of territory in this short amount of time this afternoon. We have a great help in understanding the Old Testament, and it's not even biblical Hebrew. It is the New Testament. Many times the New Testament give its own comments or later comments on events in the Old Testament, and this is one of those chapters. And so there's some verses in Acts 7, Hebrews 11, that give further information that help us make sense of Exodus chapter 2. When we were together last week, we saw from Exodus 1 that Pharaoh was on a rampage, moving from infanticide to genocide, when the courageous midwives would not carry out his instructions. He commanded in verse 22 of chapter 1 all his people, saying, to seek out the lives of young Jewish boys. This was a diabolical threat to the nation of Israel. So think about this. You are living as within the community of the children of Israel, and there is an open bounty, a command for every Egyptian to come after your little son or grandchildren. Do you think this would be a good time to get married and have children and save for a deposit? Well, evidently there was one man in Exodus 2 who believed it was a good time to get married and have children. We're told in verse 1 that a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. Evidently, this young couple were not afraid to start a family and have a child, even when, humanly speaking, there's a 50% chance of a boy, and it was a boy. Their marrying and having a son was a venture of defiant faith. Defiant faith. I remember speaking to a fellow many years ago who married, fairly comfortable, very reclusive, struggled to fit into any church, and I remember speaking with him, and I'm not sure if I asked him, and he said, my wife and I, we didn't have kids because my health's not that good and I get migraines and things. And he goes, besides, the world is a very bad place. I don't want to bring kids into the world. Now, whenever someone tells you that, what they really mean to say is they don't want to lose any sleep having children. They don't want to have their life in any way messed up or changed or stressed when they talk about the world. Such a terrible place to bring children into the world. Well, the world's been a terrible place for a long time. And I can't think of a worse time to be getting married, having children, than in this time when Pharaoh has a death sentence hanging over the birth of all male children. It was defiant faith. And I'm certain that there are many parents here that are in some discouragement about the way our world is turning out. And having to remind our children that we're praying that if you've got a daughter, we're praying that you'll grow up and you'll marry a Christian man. If you have some sons, we're praying that you'll grow up and you'll meet a Christian woman. Just to clarify things. It gets very wearying when you've got to go through those things. And so parents can be discouraged about where the world is heading. But I still don't think it's quite as bad as the children of Israel went through in Exodus 1 and 2. We later learn the names of Moses' parents, but for now it's irrelevant. They're just a young couple, trusting God. They're going to start a family at a very, very difficult, dangerous time. We're told in verse 2 that Moses was a particularly attractive, beautiful baby. Now, all mothers are terribly biased and all their babies are beautiful. I'm not going to argue that point today. Well, that's stupid. But this child was a beautiful child, no question. You'd seen that baby, you would have given that one baby a really big smile and want to cuddle. Unusually attractive baby boy. But she had to hide him. Couldn't take him to the relatives, couldn't take him around and show him off, right? As you do with newborns. Went straight into hiding. And that life for baby Moses was so dangerous that by the time he was 3 months old, he wasn't safe at home. Not safe at home at all. In Hebrews 11:23 it says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's command. They would act, of course. They would be circumspect, wise. And so they had to find a place for him to hide. It was too dangerous for the baby to stay at home, what should be the safest place for any child. Not safe. And it says in verse 3 that she could no longer hide him. She took an ark of bulrushes, like a little boat made out of reeds, and she used what we would call sort of resin or glue to put together this reed-like little ark or little boat, and put the child in it and laid baby Moses within the reeds by the riverbank. So it's safer for him to be within the reeds than to be at home. That's how dangerous things were for the baby. Egypt today still has a problem with crocodiles. I read this week and I couldn't believe it, but apparently 200 Egyptians a year are taken by crocodiles, and there are less crocodiles now than there were previously. So Moses is safer in the reeds amongst the wild birds and the crocodiles than being at home. That's how bad things are. That's how unsafe things are for the children of Israel. But there's terms of endearment in verse 3 that she puts the child in the ark and she lays it in the reeds, just terms of the care. It's almost like she's sort of tucking him into the reeds, praying that he's going to be safe. And of course then the sister, verse 4, who's Miriam, we'll meet her later on, she stands afar off and she's sort of on guard duty. So Miriam's there standing back to try and keep an eye on this baby. I mean, it's to us, it's this absurd sort of situation, but this is how diabolical it was. So if somehow the sister can sort of be on the lookout, we're going to try and keep this baby alive. Try and keep him alive. The baby would remain camouflaged within the reeds. But again, how long does that work for? How long can you keep him in an ark for? He's going to grow. He's going to cry. He's going to make noise. This plan, if it's going to work, is only going to work for so long until the baby is found, and that's exactly what happens with Moses. It's ironic that in chapter 1, verse 22, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and there's a sense in which Moses' mother does cast him into the river, but for entirely different reasons. I mean, surely this tells us that ultimately the safety of our children, our own safety, is in God's hands. Yes, use a seatbelt. Yes, follow the road rules. And yes, go out riding, put a helmet on them and all that sort of stuff. But ultimately, we can't give them another breath, let alone our own breath for that matter. And so we need to trust God for our personal safety, but still live in the process. Still serve God. And there's a wonderful providence because there is a compassionate princess. the daughter of Pharaoh comes in verse 5. And she's surrounded by an entourage of maidens as she comes down to bathe, and she sees the ark among the reeds, and she sends her maids to fetch what's there. And she opens it, and she sees a child. She sees a beautiful baby boy. Beautiful boy. And behold, the baby wept. Now, wouldn't that just break your heart? Would that melt you? A beautiful little baby boy that starts crying. You can't turn away from that scene. And it says here, so she had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. She knew it wasn't just an Egyptian baby. This was a Hebrew child. Likely she knew that he was circumcised. This is a Hebrew child. Though her father had ordered that child, including many others, would be put to death, she has compassion, human compassion. Human compassion from a pagan Egyptian princess. God can even use that. He uses just the ordinary, feminine, maternal compassion of a daughter of Pharaoh to take steps to intervene in the life of Moses. She knew her father's command was absurd. It was absurd. And by it, she condemns all those who followed, who killed Jews and said, I was just following orders. I was just doing my job. Now, she condemned all those who took the lives of Jewish people wickedly, and certainly all other kinds of genocide as well. God would use even the compassion of a pagan princess. God doesn't have to just rely upon the good intentions of believers in this world. Understand that. He can use all kinds of people, all kinds of places to achieve his glory. And Miriam is watching on. She's looking on, amazed, maybe fearful. I mean, this is kind of the last person you'd want to find your baby brother, daughter of Pharaoh. But it seems like she likes my baby brother. It seems like she's showing compassion to him. And look at verse 7. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? She makes this suggestion, which is a masterstroke. It's a masterstroke. You found it, but let us look out for our child. Can I call for a nurse that she may nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter thought this was a good idea. And Miriam, who intelligent, planning ahead. You know what she does? She goes back home and calls her mum. The same woman that put Moses in the ark and in the reeds in the first place. And notice as verse 9, Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me. She doesn't know this is the mother, the birth mother. She says, you take the child back and I'll give you your wages. I'll pay for all it's going to cost you to raise him. So the woman took the child and nursed him. The child is now safe from the death penalty, has protection from Pharaoh's daughter. And for the next few years, this child Moses is going to bond to his birth mother. He's going to be breastfed. He's going to be taught the things of God for those first few years while he's weaned. And you know what's going to happen in verse 10? He's going to go into a very long Egyptian boarding school. A very, very long Egyptian boarding school. But how amazing that though under the death penalty, you have Pharaoh's treasury looking after Moses' upbringing. God is going to use the resources of Egypt for his glory. And it says in verse 10, the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. Again, he's a toddler by now, And he's virtually going to be adopted into Pharaoh's household. And she called his name Moses, and It's a name that fits both Hebrew and Egyptian culture, because the name sounds in Hebrew like to draw out. But it also sounds in Egyptian like to bear or to give birth. This is her son now. And so he has a name that works in either culture, that would be accepted in either place. The Egyptians would call some of their sons, the pharaohs would call some of their sons after the name of a god like Thoth-Moses, born of the god of Thoth. Well, he is Moses. And he has a name that fits in either culture. It has a double meaning, fitting his Hebrew birth and his Egyptian upbringing. We know from Acts 7 that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and mighty words and deeds. He learnt all the languages and the maths and the science and the astronomy and the music and the art and the medicine and the diplomacy, all looked after by Pharaoh himself. Pharaoh has a future deliverer growing up in his own court. He has no clue. He's none the wiser. Pharaoh thinks he is hunting down the future of Israel in destroying their children, and yet the future of Israel, so to speak, the future leader, is right there. And he's looking after him. Pharaoh had his plans, but God had his. The more Pharaoh opposes God's plan, the more God uses Pharaoh to further his plan. So it's entirely counterproductive. Entirely counterproductive. God is certainly and absolutely in control, but he does so providentially, just through the ordinary circumstances of life. One of his daughters going out to the Nile River just to freshen up for the day and meets this particular baby. Do you know between verse 10 and verse 11 is 35 plus years. 35 plus years. Because in verse 11 it says, it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. He saw an Egyptian beating an Hebrew, one of his brethren. Twice it talks about his brethren, his brothers. For 35 years, his brethren were all the Egyptians that he grew up with. They were his people. But Moses, now 40, goes out, and we're not even told why. What had he been thinking in those days or weeks or months? Why now? But he goes out, he's going out to look at people he'd only heard of from a distance. Do you know Moses grew up in a court where shepherds and slaves were the lowest of the low? To be a slave was to be subhuman. And Moses goes out looking like the finest Egyptian you'd ever set eyes on. Goes out and he starts to look at how his real brothers and sisters are doing. Their plight. Do you know Moses' people, the children of Israel, had been oppressed for the last 40 years. 40 years. In Acts 7:23, when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. He had a heart burden for his people. In Hebrews 11:24, by faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. It seemed like Moses was going out to do something. He was embracing the fact that he really belonged to another people, not the people of Egypt or the household of Pharaoh. You know, maybe Moses remembered the compassion that Pharaoh's daughter had on him, and he might have thought, you know, if an Egyptian can have compassion on me, then I ought to have compassion on my own people. That would make sense. And Moses goes out and sees a Hebrew slave being savagely beaten, which was nothing unusual. It was just another day at work for the Egyptian soldiers. And I think verse 11 certainly reminds us of another Jewish man who would come, who would live and who would see and who would know what it was to suffer, to be human, and who would one day die on a cross, Jesus Christ. Suffered in all points like as we are tempted, yet without sin. Jesus identified with us in his humanity as Moses went out to look at his brethren's burdens. But there's a problem because Moses is very zealous. He's very zealous. And he does want to help his people out. And he does see a glaring injustice. He sees a horrible... to see someone being beaten savagely in front of your own eyes, that would be hard to take. Hard to take. And so he sees this beating taking place, and in verse 12 it says he looked, and I kind of smile, he looked this way and that way. You can visualise, he's just scanning the landscape. Can anyone see what I'm about to do? This now, when you read he looked this way and that way, you know it's probably not going to be very good what happens next. Because it's not just that he breaks up the beating. He could have reminded the soldier, hey, I'm Moses, I'm a prince. That's enough. That's all he had to say. All he had to say. Beating stops. But he killed the Egyptian, then hides the body, which again is another, reminds you that maybe he's feeling a bit guilty about this. To kill then to hide. It wasn't really self-defense as such. I think it was beyond that. He didn't have to kill the Egyptian to save the life of the Hebrew. God hadn't called Moses yet. Hadn't called him to lead. Hadn't appointed him as the leader. He hadn't told Moses, you need to bring justice to everything that's wrong today that you see. You need to even up the accounts against all the Egyptians the last 40 years. You need to sort it all out today. Never said a word to Moses. Never said a word to Moses. No, the answer was not vengeance. The answer was not Moses being and leading an insurrection, leading an uprising. There are many, many Jews outnumbering the Egyptians. They could have done an insurrection. You know what? The children of Israel were not going to be saved by Moses' violence. Not going to be saved that way. Or any call to arms. They weren't going to be saved even by maybe his good intentions to redress a wrong that was obvious and glaring. You see, if Moses led the children of Israel out by an insurrection and by violence and retribution, then Moses and Israel get the glory for that, don't they? They get the credit. God would need to receive the glory another way. And friends, remember, when God brings vengeance on Egypt, he does it through an ocean, a sea. God knows how to bring about his vengeance in his own perfect time. Even Jesus restored the ear of Malchus, the high priest's servant, John 18. He put his ear back on. He wasn't going to have that poor servant go on his life with one ear. When Peter responded carnally, he was going to heal that man's ear. So Moses takes things into his own hands, hides the body. Then the next day, verse 13, it's not an Egyptian bashing up a Hebrew, it's two Hebrew men fighting. They're not exactly the unified family we'd like to present to you today. They're not exactly getting on as slaves. And these two Hebrew men, they're fighting, and he said to the one who did the wrong, why are you striking your companion? He's trying to help here, trying to help. Have you ever tried to help someone and you get an earful? You're just trying to help, you're trying to be the peacemaker, you're trying to just sort of come in quietly and nicely and, and help, and you get blasted. That's what happens to Moses. Look at this guy. He says, who made you a prince and judge over us? Moses? I don't remember voting for you. You weren't on the ballot. Who are you? I haven't seen you I only met you today. You've been in Egypt, you've been in Pharaoh's court all these years, and now you're coming down to tell us how to live? And then he says, do you intend to kill me? Because you killed the Egyptian? Are you going to solve the problem the way you did yesterday, Moses? That's what you call help not wanted. And it says Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. Moses realised the secret is out. Everyone knows this thing that happened. Even the Hebrew slaves taunted Moses. Even the Hebrews resented his intrusion into their lives. They didn't want it. And so Moses is not even wanted from just these two Hebrews. And you've got 2.5 million of them at this point in the story. It gets worse for Moses. Pharaoh, verse 15, hears of this. He sought to kill Moses. Maybe some kind of, sends out some soldiers to try and take his life, and he escapes. He fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. A well. Now, do you know what Moses cannot stay. His cover is up. Everyone knows he's a Hebrew now. Can't remain in Egypt. He has a death sentence on him. He must flee. And this is going to be a long journey. This is going to be a 40-year sojourn. This is going to be a long time out in the cold. A long time. In Moses' own efforts, you know what he does? He turns people off. Turns people off. These two Hebrews don't want his help. They don't like the way he sorts things out. No thanks. No thanks. His education didn't impress anyone. His knowledge didn't impress anyone. In his own strength, he thought he was invisible. In fact, he turned people off. Perhaps it would lead to further revenge from Pharaoh. Perhaps he made things a bit harder for the children of Israel after that murder. No, Moses would not lead God's people out as a young man with energy and with all that he had learned, brimming with confidence, but he will eventually lead God's people out as an older, more seasoned man, less strong, more tired, in more need of God's help. And friends, Moses, Midian is not around the corner. Midian is over 500 kilometres away. We're talking a few weeks' journey. And when it says that Moses went to Midian, it was more a reference to a people group. They're in the Sinai Peninsula. It was a reference to a people group, shepherds, nomads, than a place. To go to Midian was, I'm going to the wilderness for 40 years. Then God used him to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt to another wilderness for 40 years. This is Moses' preparation. But you know what? In Moses returning to Midian, this was really Moses going home. He had relatives in Midian. He had relatives there. Midian was one of Abraham's sons to Keturah, the wife he married after Sarah died. Joseph was brought to Egypt by traders from Midian. This is the closest thing Moses has to family. And he goes 500 kilometres away, weeks walking or through other means. We're told in verse 16 that he comes within vicinity of a family, the priest of Midian. And as best as we know, this was a man who knew Jehovah God. Though a long way away, not identifying with God's people as such. He had 7 daughters. 7 daughters. It says they came and drew water, filled their troughs to water their father's flock, and the shepherds came and drove them away. Maybe there's just no brothers. There's no other men to do this. And so the daughters are doing this work. And there's a skirmish. There's a skirmish between the daughters of Midian and these other shepherds. And in verse 17 it says, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. Now, Moses is improved because at least he didn't kill the shepherds as well. I mean, it's like he's not learning yet. He's still overstepping the lines. He drives away the shepherds. He drives them away, blocks their attempts. You can see there's an injustice here, that these daughters are just getting bullied. They're getting bullied. They're getting overpowered. And they can't give the flocks the water that they need. Well, they're not used to having someone stand up for them. Obviously, Midian is the priest is maybe too old or not able to take them and to protect them the way Moses was able to. Well, they come home to their father. They come home, and you know what he says to them in verse 8? He says, you're home very early. You're home really early. How'd you get home so early? Did you do anything that I asked you to do today? You can't be home this early and have given water to all the flocks. And they said, an Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and he also drew enough water for us and watered the flock. Moses just looks like another Egyptian. With maybe the goatee that you've seen in some of the movies and pictures and things, and just looking all flash. This Egyptian, I mean, we've never... An Egyptian with us, around us. Yes, and it was an Egyptian. He came and he helped us. He helped us. And you know what? They were so amazed at what happened that they didn't even invite him home. They didn't say thank you, because the father says in verse 20, he says, and where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him that he may eat bread. The least you can do is give him dinner to say thank you for this kindness you've shown us. So overwhelmed. Well, this is Moses' introduction to the family. And I want you to notice, next of all, Moses, the developing servant. It says in verse 21 that he was content to live with the man. In other words, Moses did have options. He didn't have to stay there. He could have kept moving. He could have had some allies, some family connections here, but he didn't have to stay here. But for whatever reason, this is a good place to stay. He does have some new friends. He has people who he has helped and blessed. He has some company, some friendship. And he very soon has a wife as well, to add. He has a wife. He's married, 40 years old. He marries. Never too late. Never too late to get married in God's will. It's been said that Moses was 40 years in Egypt learning something. He was 40 years in the desert learning to be nothing. And then 40 years in the wilderness proving God to be everything. You know what Moses has to do for 40 years? He has to learn to serve God anonymously. In Egypt, he was something, he was someone, he had a status. Even when he outs himself as a Hebrew, he still has status. He's Moses, the man that left Pharaoh's court, standing up for us. He still has a status, but in Midian, no one cares. No one cares. He's got to learn to serve God anonymously. He's got to serve his wife and his coming children, who probably sure don't care who he is, right? Children don't care about, what kind of job you have or how much money you make or any of that sort of stuff. They don't care. Learning to be a servant. And he becomes a shepherd. He becomes the abomination that the Egyptians thought shepherds were. He becomes a shepherd. Let me ask you this, is 40 years too long for Moses to wait? Apparently not. Apparently not. I mean, it's a long time. It's a very long time. It's an awfully long time. Particularly if you want to deliver your country, right? Particularly if you've got a big job to do. Particularly if you want to bring your people out of Egyptian bondage. Because, you know what? When Moses spends another 40 years in the wilderness, his people are waiting another 40. So everyone's waiting here. John Wesley prayed in an occasion. He said, I'm no longer my own, but yours. Put me to what you will, rank me with whom you will, put me to doing, put me to suffering. Let me be employed for you or laid aside for you, exalted for you or brought low for you. Let me be full, let me be empty. That's a good prayer to pray. Let God take care of the circumstances of your life. And Moses has a son in verse 22, Gershom. He says, I've been a stranger in a strange land. His son's name means to drive out, to drive out. Moses gives his son this name to remind himself that he has his son while in a strange land, and that there was purpose and meaning in him being in Midian for all of those decades. Moses would remember those years. Giving his son the name would help him remember each day as he called his son a dozen times, 24 times every day, reminded him of God's work. We need to remember God's work in our life. Well, verse 23 jumps another 40 years. Another 40 years. It says it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. Again, we're not even given the guy's first name. We can't even distinguish him from other pharaohs. He's irrelevant to God's plan. He dies. But the problem is the Pharaoh that comes after him is just as bad. He has no more sympathy for the children of Israel. And it says the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came unto God because of the bondage. Children of Israel still suffering. And things not just bad, they're now unbearable. And so they bring their sufferings to God, which is what we're supposed to do. We tend to complain when we suffer, do we not? Let's find all our friends and tell them how miserable we are. And how hard it is for me. We want sympathy and pity, which only begins another cycle of self-pity and misery. We need to go to God who can make a difference and understand this, that God did make them wait for an answer. It wasn't an instant deliverance. And even when Moses comes on the scene, there's still going to be a process of them actually getting out of Egypt. Peter says that we're to cast our care upon him because he cares for us. We're concerned about the burden, God is concerned about us. Think about that. We're his concern. We're God's concern, but we're concerned about the things, God's concerned about us. They cry out to him. These aren't pretty prayers, friends. These aren't eloquent, beautiful prayers. These are, God, help us. Maybe didn't get much more than that. God, this is unbearable. I don't want to live anymore here. I want out. You've promised. So what happens finally? Verse 24, 25, God hears, he remembered, he looked, he acknowledged. God doesn't need to hear anything. He knows everything. God doesn't need to remember everything. He has an instant recall of everything that's ever happened. Does God even need to look? No. These are human terms to describe an unseen God. But God does look, he does remember, he does hear, and he does acknowledge. Surely the children of Israel must have thought, God, what are you doing? What are you doing all these years? Well, what God was doing, he was preparing Moses. That's what he was doing. A long, long way away from the troubles. He was preparing someone to help them. And I think we need to realise that when we are in times of our life when God doesn't seem to be answering and we're looking for a solution that's not apparent, realise that God is actually up to something that we can't see and maybe we'll never even know about. Through people that we thought God would never use in the first place. God really is at work. Let me finish today by reading Hebrews 4:15 and 16. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathise with our weaknesses, the writer says. In other words, we have someone who sympathises with us, Jesus. All points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, the writer says. Because he does understand, so come to him. And wait for the answer. Wait for the answer. Don't push ahead like Moses pushed ahead and delay things. But trust him, look to him, and he will deliver. Father, we thank you for the continuation of Exodus, and much happens in Exodus 2, from an infant to a man of 80. Thank you for working in the life of Moses, helping him, using him, preparing him. And Lord, prepare us and use us. May we not despise the years of whether it's study or maybe working a job we don't like very much or not paid well, early years of raising children and sorts of challenges we have, years fighting an illness. Lord, help us to see that you're up to something that will further your kingdom and that will be a blessing to your people. And Lord, may the Exodus be a great help and encouragement to our church and to all, Lord, that will listen and hear. Father, thank you that you are a delivering God, a prayer-answering God, a covenant-keeping God. May that remain in our hearts and minds as we leave this place to serve you this week. We ask all these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen.